Daniel Keys,
And this is Mick, the Doctor of Digital.
and welcome to Love Letters. Love Letters are a collection of love stories. How people get lost, get crazy and disoriented in the name of love. And today, another great episode, another week, a counter narrative to a modern sexual culture and toxic masculinity.
This is about reclaiming authentic intimacies, reaction to a piece entitled Where All the Men Have Gone and How to Bring All the Men Back. We explore the deepest questions about love, relationships, and human connection. We're seeing this perfect storm in modern dating culture, men retreating from relationships, women frustrated with emotional unavailability, and everyone caught between toxic masculinity influencers on one side and radical feminist rhetoric on the other.
Yes, indeed. Mr. Mick, where do we even start to unravel this mess?
This goes to the heart of human flourishing. What we're witnessing isn't just a dating crisis, it's a crisis of meaning, of identity, and ultimately of our own understanding of what it means to be authentically human in relationship with others. The early Christian writers, particularly figures like John Chrysostom and Augustine, understood that sexuality and intimacy aren't just biological drives or social constructs, but fundamental expressions of our deepest spiritual nature. When John Chrysostom wrote about marriage in the fourth century, he wasn't just giving relationship advice, he was articulating a vision of human connection that transcends the sterile transactionalism we see today. He understood that true intimacy requires what he called a symphony of souls, a harmony that emerges when two people commit to seeing each other as bearers of divine image rather than objects for consumption or conquest. The crisis you're describing, this retreat of men from authentic intimacy, actually mirrors what the early church fathers observed about the human condition more broadly. In conclusion, restlessness manifests particularly acutely in our relationships when we try to use other people to fill the existential void that only authentic spiritual grounding can address.
Mr. Mick, how do we distinguish between authentic spiritual wisdom and the kind of shame based approaches that many young people are rightfully rejecting?
It gets to the heart of why we need to return to the earliest sources rather than accepting later distortions. When you read Clement of Alexandria's writings on marriage in the second century, or the anonymous early Christian texts, The Teaching of the 12 Apostles, you find something remarkably different from the shame based Puritanism that often gets associated with Christian sexual ethics. These early thinkers understood sexuality as fundamentally creative and sacred, not something to be ashamed of, but something so precious it deserved to be protected from commodification and exploitation. Clement wrote extensively about the sacred marriage as a participation in divine creativity itself. This isn't repression, it's the recognition that sexual intimacy touches something so profound in human nature that treating it casually actually diminishes both partners. Think about how different this is from contemporary hookup culture and the toxic masculinity response to it. Modern culture says sex is just another recreational activity, while toxic masculinity treats it as conquest and scorekeeping. Both approaches ultimately leave people feeling empty and disconnected. The early Christian vision offers something radically different: sexuality as a form of mutual self gift that creates genuine intimacy and lasting joy. Research from psychologists like Helen Fisher and Eli Finkel actually supports this ancient wisdom. Fisher's work on attachment and bonding shows that casual sexual encounters flood the brain with bonding neurochemicals, but without the relational stability to sustain these bonds, people experience what she calls attachment disruption, a form of neurological and emotional whiplash that makes future bonding more difficult. In conclusion, the early church fathers weren't anti sexuality, they were pro human flourishing, which means they understood that our sexual nature deserves better than the degraded expressions we see in both libertine and toxic masculinity cultures.
Mr. Meg, we are seeing young men flock to figure like Andrew Tate or completely check out through pornography and video games or games. or join movements like men going to their own way, these men feel like masculinity itself is under attack. And honestly, when I look at some of these messaging from certain feminist quarters, I can understand why they feel that way. How would the early Christian thinkers have approached this crisis of masculine identity?
This is where the early church fathers offer something revolutionary that cuts through the false binary we're presented with today. Take Basil the Great's writings on masculinity in the 4th century. He understood that authentic masculinity isn't about dominance or withdrawal, but about what he called spiritual courage, the strength to be vulnerable, to serve, to protect without controlling. The crisis you're describing actually stems from what these ancient thinkers would recognize as a fundamental confusion about power and strength. Toxic masculinity influencers like Tate offer a counterfeit version of strength based on dominance, emotional numbness, and treating women as adversaries or objects. The MGTOW response represents the opposite extreme, withdrawal and cynicism masquerading as self protection. But listen to how John Chrysostom described authentic masculinity in his homilies on marriage. The man who loves his wife as his own body is neither harsh nor tyrannical, but gentle and patient, never cruel or domineering, for no one is harsh with their own flesh. This isn't weakness, it's the kind of strength that can afford to be tender because it's grounded in something deeper than ego or fear. Psychologically, this ancient wisdom aligns with what researchers like Brene Brown have discovered about the connection between vulnerability and authentic strength. Men who can remain emotionally available and committed despite risk or disappointment demonstrate what the ancients would have recognized as true masculine virtue. In conclusion, the ancient tradition offers men something that neither toxic masculinity nor feminist influenced culture provides: a vision of masculine strength that doesn't require dominance over others or withdrawal from intimacy, but finds its power in the capacity for faithful, self sacrificial love.
Mr. Mick, how do we honor women's dignity and agency without falling into the ideological traps that seems to be contributing to this relational breakdown?
This is perhaps where the early Christian tradition is most radical and countercultural, both to contemporary feminism and to traditional patriarchy. The early church fathers, influenced by the revolutionary example of Jesus' own relationships with women, developed an understanding of feminine dignity that transcends both categories. Look at how Jerome writes about his correspondence with brilliant women like Paula and Marcella in the 4th and 5th centuries. These weren't women confined to domestic roles. They were intellectuals, theologians, and leaders who wielded enormous influence in shaping Christian thought. Jerome didn't see their intelligence and leadership as threatening to authentic masculinity. Rather, he understood that the fullness of human community requires the distinctive gifts that women bring. But here's what's crucial, and this is where the early tradition offers something different from contemporary feminism. These church fathers understood that equality doesn't require sameness, and dignity doesn't require the elimination of complementarity. Chrysostom wrote extensively about what he called the mystery of reciprocity between masculine and feminine natures, arguing that true equality emerges not from identical roles, but from mutually enriching differences. Contemporary psychological research supports this ancient insight. John Gottman's decades of research on successful marriages shows that couples thrive when they honor both equality and complementarity, when partners contribute different but essential strengths to their shared life. Dr. Jordan Peterson's work, despite its controversies, has highlighted how the suppression of natural psychological differences between men and women often leads to frustration and resentment rather than genuine equality. What the early tradition understood, and what contemporary feminism often misses, is that women's dignity isn't threatened by acknowledging that they might approach relationships, sexuality, and emotional intimacy differently than men. In fact, honoring these differences while maintaining absolute equality of worth creates space for the kind of mutual fascination and complementarity that generates lasting romantic love. The tragedy of hookup culture isn't just that it objectifies women, It's that it eliminates the space for what Edith Stein called the feminine genius to flourish. When sexual encounters become standardized and depersonalized, both men and women lose access to the mysterious and enriching ways that masculine and feminine approaches to intimacy can enhance each other. In conclusion, authentic feminine dignity doesn't require the elimination of complementarity or the adoption of masculine approaches to sexuality and relationships. It requires the recognition that feminine wisdom about love, relationships, and emotional intimacy is so valuable that it deserves protection and cultivation rather than suppression or commodification.
Mr. Mick, what went wrong during the sexual revolution? And how does the ancient wisdom you're describing address the specific problems the sexual revolution claimed it was solving?
This is where the early church fathers demonstrate almost prophetic insight into human psychology and the nature of sexual fulfillment. The sexual revolution promised freedom, but what the ancient tradition understood is that true freedom in sexuality, as in all areas of life, comes not from the elimination of boundaries, but from the right ordering of desire toward authentic fulfillment. Augustine's analysis of disordered desire in his Confessions reads like a psychological case study of contemporary hookup culture. He describes how he pursued sexual experiences seeking fulfillment, connection, and identity validation, but found that each encounter left him more restless and disconnected than before. His insight wasn't that sexuality itself was problematic, but that sexuality detached from commitment, spiritual grounding, and genuine mutual knowledge creates what he called concupiscence, a kind of compulsive craving that can never be satisfied. Modern neuroscience validates this ancient wisdom in startling ways. Dr. William Struthers' research on pornography and sexual behavior shows that casual sexual experiences create neurological patterns similar to addiction. The brain releases dopamine in anticipation of sexual novelty, but develops tolerance requiring ever increasing stimulation to achieve the same neurochemical rewards. This is exactly the restless compulsive pattern Augustine described 1600 years ago. The sexual revolution promised to eliminate sexual shame and dysfunction, but instead created new forms of both. The early Christian understanding was that sexual shame comes not from having sexual desire, but from experiencing sexuality in ways that violate our deepest nature as relational beings created for communion. When sexuality becomes detached from the kind of committed, intimate knowing that allows for true vulnerability, it inevitably generates shame, not because sexuality is bad, but because we're experiencing it in a context that can't support its full flourishing. Think about the cultural moment we're living in. The sexual revolution promised that removing sexual boundaries would create more satisfying relationships, but research consistently shows that people in committed, monogamous relationships report higher levels of sexual satisfaction than those in casual sexual relationships. The ancient tradition understood why. Sexual intimacy reaches its fullest expression when it occurs within a context of complete mutual knowledge, acceptance, and commitment. The revolution also promised to eliminate the battle between the sexes, but instead created new forms of mutual incomprehension and resentment. By treating sexual differences as either non existent or problematic rather than complementary and enriching, it eliminated the space for what the Song of Songs celebrates: the mutual fascination and delight that emerges when masculine and feminine approaches to love enhance rather than compete with each other. Here's where the popular culture of the 1960s reveals the deeper currents at work. When Bob Dylan sang Like a Rolling Stone, he captured something profound about the existential homelessness that comes from rejecting all forms of commitment and stability. The song's protagonist achieves complete autonomy, but discovers it leads to alienation rather than fulfillment. This mirrors what happened both culturally with sexual liberation. The elimination of boundaries promised freedom, but delivered isolation. In conclusion, the sexual revolution failed because it was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of human nature and sexual psychology. It promised that freedom from commitment would lead to fulfillment, but the ancient tradition understood that authentic sexual freedom emerges only within relationships characterized by permanent, mutual self gift.
Mr. Mick, how would you early Christians or Christian thinkers have understood what pornography does to human sexuality and relationships?
This is where the early church fathers demonstrate remarkable psychological sophistication in their understanding of how visual imagery shapes desire and character. The Desert Fathers, particularly Ponticus in the 4th century, wrote extensively about what he called fantasia, the way that cultivated mental images create compulsive patterns of thought and behavior that ultimately enslave rather than liberate. Evagrius understood that the mind becomes like what it habitually contemplates when we repeatedly expose ourselves to images that present other human beings as objects for consumption rather than persons worthy of love and respect. We literally rewire our capacity for authentic intimacy. This isn't moralistic judgment, it's psychological observation about how attention and desire formation work. John Cassian, writing in the 5th century, described how sexual fantasy creates what he called false intimacy, the illusion of connection without the vulnerability, commitment, and mutual self knowledge that characterize genuine intimacy. This perfectly describes what contemporary research reveals about pornography's impact on relationships. Dr. Gary Wilson's research on pornography and brain chemistry shows that regular pornography use creates neuroplasticity changes similar to those seen in substance addiction. The brain develops tolerance to sexual imagery, requiring increasingly extreme content to achieve arousal, while simultaneously losing sensitivity to the subtler rewards of real relational intimacy. Users often report that their partners seem less attractive or sexually interesting compared to the artificial stimulation of pornographic imagery. Pornography presents sexuality as consumption, performance, and power rather than intimacy, vulnerability, and mutual delight. It trains users to approach real partners with the expectations and behaviors they've learned from consuming pornographic imagery, treating sexual intimacy as something to be taken rather than shared, performed rather than experienced together. What's particularly tragic is how pornography affects young men's understanding of masculine sexuality. Instead of learning that sexual desire can be a form of genius attention and generous attention to another person's well being and pleasure, they learn to associate sexuality with dominance, performance anxiety, and self focused gratification. This creates the very sexual dysfunction and relational anxiety that drives many young men towards either toxic masculinity or complete withdrawal from dating. In conclusion, the early Christian understanding of pornography's danger wasn't based on prudishness, but on profound psychological insight. They recognized that what we allow our minds to habitually contemplate literally shapes our capacity for the kind of vulnerable, generous love that makes authentic intimacy possible.
How do we present marriage as compelling to a generation that seems so many marriage fall, Mr. Meg?
Well, you've identified the crucial paradox of our time. Marriage appears conventional while actually representing the most countercultural choice available to young adults today. The young early church fathers understood this perfectly. When Paul wrote about marriage in Ephesians 5, he wasn't advising a stable traditional society. He was offering a revolutionary vision to people living in a culture of casual divorce, sexual exploitation, and relational instability remarkably similar to our own. What made early Christian marriage radical wasn't its legal structure, but its fundamental purpose: the transformation of two autonomous individuals into a new form of human existence based on permanent mutual self gift. John Chrysostom called this the mystery of becoming one flesh, not just physical union, but the creation of a shared life so complete the well being of one partner becomes inseparable from the well being of the other. This is profoundly countercultural to a society organized around individual autonomy and consumer choice. When someone commits to marriage, as the early Christians understood it, they're rejecting the fundamental premise of contemporary culture that relationships exist primarily to serve individual fulfillment and should be maintained only as long as they provide personal satisfaction. But here's what's brilliant about this ancient vision: it actually delivers the intimacy, security, and personal growth that contemporary culture promises but can't provide. Dr. Scott Stanley's research on commitment and relationship satisfaction shows that couples who approach marriage as a permanent covenant report dramatically higher levels of relationship satisfaction, sexual fulfillment, and individual well being than those who view it as an extended trial period. Think about how different this is from the narrative our culture provides. Contemporary dating culture promises that keeping your options open will lead to finding someone better, but actually creates chronic anxiety and prevents the deep knowing that comes from committed exploration of one person's complexity. Marriage as a covenant promises that choosing limitation, choosing this one person, actually opens up infinite possibilities for mutual discovery and growth. The pop culture of the early 1970s captured something profound about this dynamic. When Carole King sang So Far Away, she articulated the existential loneliness that comes from a life of endless possibilities without permanent commitment. The song's longing isn't just for romantic connection, but for the kind of security that allows authentic vulnerability. Marriage provides exactly this, not as a limitation on freedom, but as the foundation that makes real emotional and spiritual freedom possible. Contemporary marriage fails when it's approached as an upgraded version of dating rather than a fundamentally different form of human relationship. The early Christian vision understood that marriage requires the death of the autonomous self to birth of a new form of existence based on shared identity and mutual submission. In conclusion, marriage represents the ultimate countercultural choice because it requires rejecting the individualistic assumptions of contemporary society in favor of a view of human flourishing based on permanent covenantal love.
Mr. Mick, how do we apply these ancient insight to modern dating? What it looks like to date with this vision of eventual marriage and authentic intimacy in mind, while still living in a culture organized around every different principles.
This is where the early Christian approach becomes intensely practical rather than merely idealistic. The church fathers developed what we might call a formation based approach to relationships. The idea that dating should be fundamentally about character formation and mutual discernment rather than entertainment or physical gratification. Take the approach described in the early Christian text, The Shepherd of Hermas. It emphasizes that relationships should be oriented toward helping each partner become the best version of themselves rather than merely enjoying each other's company. This means that every dating interaction becomes an opportunity to practice the virtues, patience, kindness, honesty, courage that will be essential for successful marriage. Practically, this changes everything about how you approach dating. Instead of asking, am I having fun? Or are we physically compatible? The primary questions become, is this relationship helping me grow in virtue? And are we developing the kind of friendship and mutual respect that could sustain a lifetime partnership? Dr. Scott Stanley's research on relationship formation supports this ancient wisdom. His studies show that couples who prioritize friendship, shared values, and character compatibility before physical intimacy have dramatically higher relationship satisfaction and lower divorce rates than those who follow contemporary dating scripts. Here's what this looks like practically. Start with group settings rather than isolated romantic encounters. The early Christians understood that authentic character is revealed in community context rather than artificial dating scenarios. Pay attention to how potential partners treat servers, interact with their families, and handle stress and disappointment. These reveal character in ways that romantic conversations cannot. Set physical boundaries that preserve space for emotional and intellectual intimacy to develop. The early church fathers understood that premature physical intimacy often prevents couples from developing the friendship and mutual respect necessary for lasting love. This isn't about rigid rules, but about creating conditions where authentic compatibility can be discerned. Most importantly, approach dating as preparation for marriage rather than an end in itself. This means being honest about your ultimate intentions, developing the communication and conflict resolution skills you'll need as a spouse, and cultivating the spiritual and emotional maturity that lasting commitment requires. The cultural moment of the late 1960s offers an interesting parallel. When Johnny Cash sang Ring of Fire, he captured both the danger and transformative power of authentic love. It burns, but it also purifies and creates something new. Dating with marriage in mind requires accepting this kind of risk and transformation rather than seeking relationships that merely affirm who you already are. Here's the paradox: this approach actually makes dating more exciting, not less. When you're looking for someone with whom you could build a lifetime partnership, every conversation becomes more meaningful, every shared experience more significant. You're not just enjoying each other's company, you're exploring the possibility of shared destiny. In conclusion, applying ancient wisdom to modern dating means approaching relationships as formation opportunities rather than entertainment, prioritizing character over chemistry, and maintaining the long term vision of marriage as the context that gives dating its ultimate meaning and purpose.
Mr. Meg, what gives you hope that this ancient wisdom can actually take root in a contemporary culture? And what encouragement would you offer to someone who wants to live this way but feels alone in it?
This is where I find the most hope, precisely because what we're describing is so countercultural. It represents genuine choice rather than mere conformity. The early Christians lived as a tiny minority in a Roman culture that was just as sexually permissive and relationally chaotic as ours. What gave them power wasn't cultural support, but the recognition that their way of life actually worked better than the alternatives. I see this happening already among young adults who are quietly rejecting hookup culture, not because of religious pressure, but because it's making them miserable. The sexual recession that sociologists are documenting among Gen Z isn't just about anxiety and technology. It's about intelligent young people recognizing that contemporary sexual culture isn't delivering on its promises. Look at the unexpected popularity of figures like Jordan Peterson or the growth of movements like dating intentionally, even in secular contexts. Young people are hungering for structure, meaning, and genuine intimacy precisely because they've experienced the emptiness of unlimited choice without commitment. The early church father John Climacus wrote about what he called the ladder of divine ascent, the idea that living according to wisdom creates an upward spiral of growth and fulfillment that becomes its own motivation. I see this in couples who've chosen to prioritize friendship, character, and commitment. They report levels of satisfaction and intimacy that makes their lifestyle attractive to others. But here's what's crucial for someone feeling isolated. The early Christians understood that countercultural living requires intentional community. You cannot sustain this kind of life alone. This means actively seeking out friends, mentors, and communities that share these values, even if they're small or hard to find. What's particularly encouraging is how this vision appeals to both men and women who are exhausted by the gender wars. The early Christian approach offers men a vision of masculine strength that doesn't require dominating women, and it offers women dignity that doesn't require rejecting femininity. Both sexes find relief in an approach that celebrates complementarity rather than demanding either sameness or hierarchy. The cultural moment we're living in, though, reminds me of the late 1950s transition captured in songs like The Great Pretender by the Platters. There's a growing recognition that much of contemporary sexual culture involves pretending to be satisfied with relationships that are actually leaving people empty and disconnected. The song's melancholy honesty about performing happiness while feeling lonely internally describes exactly what many young adults experience in hookup culture. But unlike the 1950s, we now have both the ancient wisdom tradition and modern psychological research confirming what works for human flourishing in relationships. Young people don't have to choose between sexual repression and sexual chaos. They can choose the third way that the early Christians pioneered. Here's my deepest source of hope. Authentic love always wins in the end because it's aligned with human nature in ways that counterfeits never can be. When people experience real intimacy based on commitment, vulnerability, and mutual self gift, they never want to go back to the shallow alternatives, and they become living advertisements for a better way. For someone living alone in this commitment, remember that you're participating in a tradition that spans centuries, includes some of the most brilliant, courageous, and fulfilled people in human history. You're not missing out. You're choosing depth over surface, reality over illusion, lasting joy over temporary pleasure. In conclusion, hope comes from recognizing that we're not trying to impose an artificial system on unwilling human nature, but rather rediscovering the conditions under which human beings naturally flourish in relationship, conditions that work just as well today as they did 2,000 years ago.
Mr. Mick, for listeners who feel drawn to this approach, what is the first step they can take tomorrow?
Yeah, it's a good question because the first step is always internal. It's what Augustine called the conversion and conversation of desire. Begin by honestly examining what you're actually looking for in relationships. Are you seeking someone to fill an existential void? Are you prepared to offer genuine love to another person? Are you approaching dating as entertainment or as preparation for the kind of committed partnership that creates lasting fulfillment? This requires what the early Christians called examination of conscience, not self condemnation, but honest assessment of your current patterns and motivations. Most people discover that they're unconsciously shaped by cultural assumptions about relationships that actually work against their deepest longings for authentic connection. The second step is formation, actively cultivating the character traits that make lasting love possible. This means practicing patience, kindness, honesty, and courage in all your relationships, not just romantic ones. It means developing emotional maturity, conflict resolution skills, and the capacity for vulnerability that committed partnership requires. First, seek community with others who share this vision, whether that's a religious community, a group of friends, or even online spaces where people discuss intentional relationships. You need support for living countercultural truth in a culture organized around very different principles. The invitation here isn't to a life of restriction and unhappiness, to what the early Christians called abundant life, relationships characterized by the kind of intimacy, security, and joy that our deepest nature craves. In conclusion, till next time on Love Letters, I'm reminding you that real love isn't a feeling that happens to you. It's a choice you make every day, and it's worth every sacrifice required to protect and cultivate it.
It's a choice indeed, and very well said, Mr. Mick. Very well said. In a cultural landscape often dominated by performative hypersexuality and restrictive definition of manhood and powerful counter narrative is emerging, no one that champions intimacy over conquest and wholeness over hardness. Mr. Mike, would you like to plug in something?
I appreciate the opportunity. Write the book, grow the business, and meet with me on LinkedIn, GMIC, the Doctor of Digital Smith, PhD, and also listen to the Doctor of Digital podcast. Couple volumes out on Amazon, Burning America, and On Track Ian Hunter.
Yes, indeed. Let's support Mr. Meg, the Doctor of Digital, because if you support him for sure, more empowering books to come, more empowering episodes of the podcast itself. And please do listen to our baby podcast, Mental Health 101. Now, Mental Health 101 is created to empower our mental health awareness. So, Mr. Meg, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, my friend. Until next time, Deus Volt.
More to come, people. See you soon.